we have a wonderful coincidence here today. This buggy was from the McCormick Ranch up on Spring Mountain Road. And it was donated by Sandra Leonard Perry, who is a descendant of the McCormicks. And our speaker, John McCormick, is also a descendant of the McCormicks.
Yes. So I'm taking the buggy with me when I leave, I think is the plan, right?
Good luck.
I know, good luck. I'm getting it through the door.
William Newton McCormick married Nancy York, who's the daughter of our earliest residents, John and Lucinda Hudson York. And their son, Dr. C.H. McCormick, lived in Napa, and his son, Harold. And then his son, Thomas, is John's father.
Mm-hmm.
So John has received a BA in engineering from Berkeley, and he worked in the software industry. And upon retirement, just for fun, he earned a master's degree in history from Harvard.
See.
He took a class in U.S. and China relations and came across an article from the Helena Historical Society about Chinese vineyard workers, which piqued his interest in this topic. And so you can explain what happened after that.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. Yeah, and thank you, and welcome everybody to come. Yeah, so it was an interesting thing, because I am perhaps one of the, not exactly what you'd expect, who's kind of giving some sort of talk about Chinese history, right? What is it about? Well, so as Miriam mentioned, I was doing this Master's in History program, and I took this class in the history of U.S.-China relations. And one of the things you have to do is part of the thing, it's here at Cambridge, you go back and forth, and it was like, well, you have to, write a paper. So I was kind of like, well, what am I going to write about? And I'm just like, well, I wonder if there's anything local. I didn't think so. And so I, Google, and I come up with an article that Miriam wrote on the Helena Historical Society website about Chinese in Napa Valley and working in the vineyards. And I grew up in Napa, 5 generations back, and went, Salvador and Redwood Vintage High School. And it's like, we were not taught this. This is nothing that, this can't be, I don't want to say it couldn't be true, but it's like, are you sure? And I kind of did a little more digging, and yes, it turns out not only did they work in the vineyards, but the Chinese were an integral part of the economy, in the entire Napa Valley between 1870 and 1900. And this is, it's just crazy. And so I started doing some more and wrote the paper, and it was fascinating. I did an early presentation to the Chinese Historical Society of America. They're out of San Francisco. And it was Zoom, because it's like height of the pandemic. And they were very, because I was like, well, am I the right person to tell this story? And they were very encouraging. It's like, oh, this is a story that's important. You need to get this out. And so we end up, I made the subject of my thesis, my master's thesis at Harvard. And then, one of the things that really got me when doing that part, as the pandemic was rising, as you all know, plenty of crummy things with the pandemic, but one of the incredibly horrible things with the rise of anti-Asian hate. Right? And so, we're all sitting there, we're watching on the news, and it's like, and we're all impotent, right? I feel impotent the last 2 days seeing what's going on. But then it's like, well, what can you do, right? And what can a fledgling historian do? What can any of us do? And I thought, well, this story should be told, right? That is something I can do to kind of tell this, it's like, as I put in the subtitle of the book, it's like the forgotten history, right? None of us know. Now, I have subsequently learned that in St. Helena, it is taught in the schools, which is great. It is not taught in the schools in Napa. And it certainly was not taught, at least when I grew up. And so St. Helena is ahead of the game, which is terrific, but it should be more widely known. So I think that's a really important thing. So I end up doing, was I going to do like an academic book? Because what I also found during the research is it is not written anywhere. Miriam had the most comprehensive kind of article on it, and so there was no secondary sources to draw from. And so we ended up having to do a lot of original research, and I decided it was important to do it kind of as a general history book, because the goal is to just disseminate the information, right? It's really, I think, important, and that's how it all came from. And in the acknowledgement section in the book, the first lines is about Miriam, and thanking her for her hard work. And I will say, she is just like, she knows so much. It's a little intimidating presenting in front of her, because she probably knows all this stuff anyway. But it's terrific. So thank you very much. And so the goal is, we'll just do a little kind of overview, kind of the arc of, because it is an interesting thing. This is a very discrete time frame. It's really 1870 to 1900, and then they're gone, more or less. And like, well, how did this happen? So it's actually a fairly interesting story to tell. And so that's my goal, is, take 45 minutes, we'll go through the story. We definitely could do some questions afterwards. If you want to do it during, that's fine too, whatever you want to do. But so the thought, first I want to just back up a little bit and say, well, why were the Chinese here anyway, right? How did they get here, and why is this even a thing? And so just do a little bit on that, the level setting, and then talk about the successes, because I think that's one of the key things, is actually a success story. Now, there's plenty of bad stuff that happened, which we're not going to gloss over, but I think how successful the Chinese workers were in these 30 years, especially when they're facing this unprecedented discrimination, is really interesting, and I think that is really a topic kind of worth talking about. And then we'll talk about kind of a little bit on the social and cultural life, like, well, how did they live, right? Where did they live, and what did they do for fun? How do they integrate with communities? And then we will end with kind of the arc of the story, which is like the rise of the anti-Chinese sentiment. And it was in St. Helena, certainly, but in Napa, Calistoga, everywhere. And then the forgotten Chinese. How did we lose our memory, our collective memory of them? And especially then, how did the Italians become kind of the founding kind of idea of the winemakers and so on? So that's the plan for the next few minutes. So I don't need to tell you guys much about Napa Valley. You guys know it all, right? But I mean, we got almost 500 wineries here, right? 4 million annual visitors, at least before COVID. I think it's probably close to that now. And an economic output of $34 billion, right? Just in this area, which is just crazy, right? And a lot of it now, of course, is the wine industry, right? That's what we're all known for. And the commercial wine industry, more or less, began around 1870. And as I mentioned, 1870 and 1900, almost all vineyard workers were Chinese. But it wasn't just the vineyard workers, right? They were also in mining, which we'll talk about, in the tannery, leather working, laundry, domestic workers, and so on. They were all over all industries in the Napa Valley. And, but as I mentioned, by the early 1900s, they were almost entirely displaced by Italian immigrants and others, and more or less run out of town. And right now, and I was talking to Anna earlier, we really have practically no memorials or acknowledgments to their contribution. Now I will say, so these posters, which are pretty amazing actually, they are in the Heritage Center next door here. So St. Helena Historical Society is doing a good work, but we don't have a plaque, we don't have a monument, we don't have a statue, we don't have anything kind of documenting their progress. So maybe we're going to do something in St. Helena. I'm working on something in Napa, but I think that is so I would certainly encourage us all to support that. So we're going to talk about Napa, and I have two things, and of course Napa hasn't changed a whole lot, right? So over here we've got what we consider the current Napa, which is all about wine there. This is a picture of a map of Napa from the 1880s, and it's very similar to what we have today, right? It's more or less the same towns. Of course, we didn't have Highway 29 going up the valley. We had the Napa Valley Railroad, right? That was the main kind of link that linked everything together. But we still have Napa, Yountville, Oakville, Rutherford, St. Helena, and Calistoga. Now at the top, they talk about Calistoga mines, which of course we don't talk about now. But we'll talk about that. That's important, I think, we think about what the Chinese did with quicksilver and quicksilver mining. And that was all more or less at the base and around Mount St. Helena. So one of the challenges we've got in writing this book is we almost have no primary sources from the Chinese themselves, right? And that's one of the reasons why I think it was so easy to forget them, right? Now, they were not necessarily illiterate. Now, that is a thing. I'll take a quick little sidelight to say, the book, it's by me, and there's a foreword from Connie Young Yu. So Connie Young Yu is a very well-known, she is Chinese American, and she's a local historian. She lives in San Jose and does a lot of work around San Jose's Chinatown. And she wrote the foreword to the book. And she also was pretty integral in helping me with kind of making sure, like, especially all the community things and things around culturally that I was not that aware of. And so she was, made sure that, when we talked about the Chinese, that it was correct and culturally, like, oh yeah, things that are not taught anywhere, written down anywhere. It was very useful to understand her perspective. And one of the things she did bring to light to me, which I didn't know, because we were taught at Harvard, that basically they were all illiterate. Okay, Chinese immigrants were illiterate. Well, it turns out they were not illiterate, actually. There were 20 Chinese language newspapers out of San Francisco alone in this time frame. But many were, because the people that came over were peasants, very poor people looking to make a better life for themselves. But for whatever reason, they did not leave any written records themselves. And so we are stuck with a couple of different things, right? So the main source for a lot of the information we have is newspapers, okay? St. Helena Star was a big one, and of course Napa Register. They neither liked the Chinese very much, right? And so there were a lot of articles, right? It was an area of really intense local interest. There were regular news articles, there were letters to the editor, there were all sorts of things about the Chinese. And so you can get a lot from it. There's a treasure trove of information, but you really have to read it. There's obviously a lot of anti-Chinese bias, but you can sift through it and you can get some core nuggets on what was going on. The best thing we get, and you can see it actually here, in fact, the Chinese themselves, especially the ones that were merchants, put ads in the paper, right? So we do get their voice a little bit coming through. So that was always nice. And what I also found is whenever they advertised in the paper, their rhetoric went down a notch on the editorial side. So I think as long as you advertised with them, you got preferential treatment, which hasn't really changed much today. But the other things we have, there's some magazines that came out. There's local history. I was lucky. There is a oral history. We have a man named Jack Jew, who's a physician out of the Sacramento area. He wrote a family blog and talking about his great-grandfather who came over from China. His name was Ju Zhou, and he came over in 1874 from China, landed in San Francisco, was helped by the Chinese 6 companies, and was in Marysville, and then worked in St. Helena vineyards for 6 years. Between 1880 and 1886. And since we have some oral history, which helped a lot, right? And so we kind of have his recollections to help flesh out the book. And in the book, what I tried to do is, where possible, because a history book, but you kind of intersperse it with elements of Ju Zhou's life as it went through. So it kind of helped kind of reinforce and bring it down to the person, because that, I think, makes it more interesting. We're always interested by hearing stories about people. So briefly, why Chinese labor? Like, why were the Chinese here anyway? And so you may know some of this. It's not secret, some of it, of course. But the big thing, of course, was the gold rush, right? The gold mines, right? So the same thing that brought people to California from the East Coast and from Europe, wherever. When the gold was struck and it came through, the Chinese, especially in the mid-1800s, China was in a really bad space. There was all sorts of uprisings and peasant revolts, and it was a very economically depressed area. And so, especially from the Canton province, the Canton region of China, that was the one area that was actually more open to the West, right? So China at the time was a very closed society. They had just really one port that was available to the West, and of course that's where we had the Opium Wars, all that kind of stuff. It was in the Canton region. But it was an area that actually, you could actually depart. Even though it was illegal, you can actually leave China from there and get there and come back. And so the Chinese that came here were all Cantonese. They spoke Cantonese. They were from Canton, then eventually Hong Kong. So that's the area that they came from. And so a lot of them came for gold, to make it rich, gold mining. So as we all know, 49ers, right? Gold was struck actually 1848, but 1849 was the big push. They didn't get here until 1852, and by the time they got here in 1852, unfortunately, a lot of the easy-to-mine gold was gone, right? So by that time, even the big companies were coming in and they were taking over, and you had to be kind of a conglomerate to make a lot of money, but they still eked out a living at the gold mines. And so they did for a couple of decades, eked out just the dregs of the mining, but even that modest success caused a lot of resentment from the white and European miners that were there. And that was the start of the anti-Chinese movement, kind of the anti-Chinese labor movement at the time. But once the other big push was the railroads, right? So the Transcontinental Railroad that was, coming from, that linked us together, that was so hard getting through the Sierra Nevada mountains, right? That the railroads couldn't find white American workers to do the work, so they recruited heavily from China, especially from Hong Kong. So we had thousands of immigrants come over from China, from Hong Kong to work on the railroad, which they did amazingly well in 1869, right? We connected everything together. You have a lot of Chinese labor coming in from those two things, and then they kind of rolled into agriculture, right? Because agriculture was big business in California. It is now, it was then. That was the big thing. But agriculture in California had some drawbacks, right? Land was very expensive. Hard to believe, right? Because when California was just recently a state, but a lot of the area was already taken over from Spanish and Mexican land grants. So, and to make it as you were a farmer, to make it work, you had to try to piece a lot of pieces of land together. Also, capital was very expensive, right? Because a lot of the banks were in East Coast and in Europe. Transportation, even though we had the railroad, it was still expensive to transport things back from California. Marketing, to advertise your stuff, was expensive. So the one thing that all these agribusiness could control, or thought they controlled, was labor cost. And Chinese were a lower labor cost than the others because Chinese were prohibited from working in a lot of different other areas, right? So they would actually work more cheaply, and so they were one of the main labor force agriculture in the Central Valley, as well as Napa. So here we come to the Napa part of the story, right? So 1870s and so on. 1860s, as we know, the Civil War and so on, disrupted a lot of trade between the East Coast and Europe to out here in the Wild West, right? And so that's when we started getting settlements in Sonoma and Napa, and the first kind of inklings of the wine industry was born. And because of the Civil War, there was a lot of disruption in trade, so the local vineyards were kind of left on their own devices. They can kind of grow without a lot of competition. And so they kind of took off from that, and that's how they kind of started having their fledgling vineyards. And then by the time the mid-1870s happened, and we had the railroads were done, but when they worked on the railroads, there was a labor gang model, right? So you had gangs of Chinese that were together under a labor boss who spoke a little English, so he was the one that tended to translate. When dealing with a lot of, especially with the harvest and so on, right? You'd surge, you need a bunch of workers for a short amount of time, and they go away, and the Chinese labor gangs were just perfect for that. And then in 1878, the big thing was you had the blight, right, called phylloxera, which was decimating the vineyards in France, right? Decimating the vineyards in France. And then the local wineries, especially the ones in St. Helena, said, this is our chance, right? You've got the wines from Europe are no longer going to come in. We got to plant, we got to grow. And so they just expanded and went on this massive planting spree to plant more vineyards. But where are they going to get the workers? Well, the Chinese, so bring them on in. So we had this rapid rise in Chinese labor because of the growth of vineyards, among others. Now, through all of this, interestingly, and it's important to understand, right, the Chinese were fighting against multiple layers of discrimination. At the national level, in kind of the history of immigration, the most notorious law is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first law that prohibited immigration to the United States based on your race, and it was Chinese. So if you were Chinese, if you were Chinese labor, you were not allowed to immigrate to the United States starting in 1882. There were they forgot to say, because I think originally said from China, and so Chinese then tried to immigrate via Canada and Mexico. So in 1883, they closed that loophole. And so you had tens of thousands of Chinese every year coming in every year until 1882, 1883, and then went down to like 12. It just completely shut off the thing. So they were as a national policy, we said no more Chinese, right? Now, why is that? Well, because the state of California. So California was very anti-Chinese. In the 1879-1880 California Constitution, there was like 19 articles, and it had a single article that was entitled Chinese, talking about how bad Chinese were for the country, how they led to our moral decay, how they were not allowed to work in a corporation, work for government, work on anything else. So it was written into our Constitution. Now, just briefly, the reason why, it's because of labor. So in the 1870s, California was very much balanced between the two political parties, right? And so every couple of terms, the governor would switch, and California was very much the Wild West. The only group that was organized at all for political purposes was labor. And there's white labor, and labor, they were a single issue block, no Chinese, right? And so whatever candidate for governor or whatever could get the labor movement on their side, the 2 or 3% of the population, they would win the next election, right? So even if the governors or whatever themselves didn't care that much, they knew they had to be more anti-Chinese than their opponent to get the labor vote. And so that's why you kept getting these really draconian, much more than, Chinese were integral to the success of California, but you had the politicians fighting against them, well, because they couldn't get elected. In the same way, at the national level, California was also instrumental in the balance of power there. And so you had the national stage having more and more anti-Chinese because they wanted California's votes, and California's becoming one labor. So it was interesting, you had very much a small tail wagging the dog here. Finally, though, locally, Napa, St. Helena, Calistoga were all guilty of the same forces that were at the state and national level, right? There were anti-Chinese leagues formed, local newspapers were very much against them, and there was a lot of complaining from citizens that these Chinese workers who would come over to make a better life for themselves and then go back were sending their money back home and not spending the money locally, right? We hear that all the time as well. And they took away jobs from white laborers, which of course the Chinese laborers wouldn't even be here if there were white laborers willing to do the work. But that was certainly the story. So just briefly, what we have here, it's interesting to see the growth, if you can read that there. The type is the top line there is the white Anglo population of the Napa Valley. And actually, most of the time here, this is obviously Napa County because everything's the county level, but Napa Valley and Napa County were very, obviously there's a high overlap. You can see from 1860, 1870, 1880 to 1890, the white population grew considerably, right? We were going from 5,000 to 12,000, 15,000 in just 30 years, right? So you're doubling almost tripling your population. The Chinese population went from 17 up to a high of 900. So still, it was not like they were dominating things, but the ratio, the proportion of them was incredibly high, right? And so I think that everybody very scared. And so that was caused a lot of the kind of Chinese feeling, sentiment. And of course, we can't forget that this is on the census, and the census always dramatically undercounts minorities, so it was probably more than that. A lot of the work we had to do, was on census forms. So census forms are not digitized, they're scanned, but not digitized. So you had to go through and do a lot of physical counting. But just in 1880, you can look here and you can see the wide variety of jobs that the Chinese workers were doing just in 1880. And so the main one is laborer, which is the catch-all phrase for anything in the vineyards, on the farms, and so on. But they were also cooks, worked in the railroad, tannery, laundry, domestic servers. They were miners, the vineyard workers specifically, and so on. And you have to think this is probably dramatically underrepresented what they were actually doing. But it's just phenomenal the amount of different kinds of things that the Chinese were doing. So that's why they were here, right? That's why they were here, because economic forces drove them here. They wanted a better life for themselves. But they were actually pretty successful. And why were they successful? And we can talk about why were they hired? So we'll talk about both in the countryside and in the cities. So the countryside. So let's start with the wine, because that's what we all care about, certainly nowadays. So they were vineyards. Why were they hired in the vineyards? Well, they were cheaper. I mean, bottom line, that's the main reason, right? So Charles Krug talked about in 1880 that he was paying his Chinese laborers $1 a day for working there. And that was just, now white labor, you could pay $1 a day if you gave them room and board, so if you fed them and housed them, or $1.50 a day if you didn't. So right away, the Chinese workers were making, were 2/3 the wage. Well, why wouldn't you do that? The other thing too is that the Chinese workers had this reputation of being compliant and docile. So this is the late 1880s. We're definitely still in the Wild West. A lot of the white laborers had the reputation of being very unreliable. And basically, the kind of story is told. If there's another gold strike or silver strike in the Sierra Nevada, everybody would just drop their tools and run up and try to strike it rich, right? So you couldn't count on them. The Chinese, on the other hand, had a reputation of being very they were very responsible. When they signed a labor contract, they would follow it. There was a testimony in front of the Senate about this man who worked on the kind of doing contracts for the Chinese and the railroads. And he said he knew about 20 or 30,000 different contracts signed by individual Chinese to do work, and not a single one was ever broken. Right, so they were very reliable workers, and they didn't drink a lot, so they were actually they were very attractive to the vineyard owners and others, because they were a great labor force. And then the final thing, which is interesting, that you will appreciate, if you look here, so this is a picture of a vineyard back there, and what's different, right? You think of vineyards today, we see all the vineyards with the wires, right, and everything is 3 feet off the ground and so on. Back in the 1880s, vineyards were on the ground, vines were on the ground, and so to pick the vines, you had to bend over or stoop. It's called stoop labor, and white laborers hated stoop labor. They considered it demeaning, and they wouldn't do it. Okay? Chinese laborers didn't have any sort of preconceived notion on that, so they're, well, great, it's just what we got to do, right? So they would bend over and pick, and so it was considered kind of a racially demeaning thing to do stoop labor, but the Chinese were willing to do it. In addition to working in the vineyards, they also kind of do all the manual labor around the wineries, including digging wine caves. So these are pictures I took at Schramsberg Winery. If you've ever been there, it's a beautiful place. No more for champagne, I think, but they do a bunch of different things. And in 1860, Jacob Schramm founded the winery, and then in the 1870s, he had Chinese workers there, and they dug out wine caves to store the wine. And they were experiencing this because they worked on the railroad, a lot of them did, so they knew how to blast tunnels through the mountain. They used that thing. And those caves are still used today. And so a couple pictures there, you can see kind of very intricate kind of caves. And even on the right here, you can see the pick marks. They're still left from the Chinese workers that were digging the thing. So it's one of the few physical monuments and testaments we actually have to the Chinese that were here. And this is a interesting story. So as one of the kind of the pivotal moments in wine and making Napa Valley so famous in winery was Harper's Weekly. So Harper's Weekly was a very famous kind of weekly news magazine that was national. And they sent a reporter and a sketch artist to the Napa Valley and Sonoma Valley in 1878 to kind of document the wine. And this article is credited with a lot of making Napa Valley wines famous. Now, the article was great. The sketch artist, then this was a picture that was in the article. Now, you can see over here, right, we've got, you got people, with the grapes, they got the bushels of grapes, and you're working on the press, and you've got some Chinese up here stomping grapes with their feet. And the winery owners were worried about this because, like, oh, you have these kind of foreign workers working here that are bringing foreign diseases. And yes, there was a huge outcry from the reading public that, oh my God, you've had all these foreigners making your wine with their feet. And there was a lot of pressure to get rid of the Chinese workers. Well, the vineyard owners didn't, for the very reasons we talked about, because they were cheap and reliable, but also because this wasn't true. This was kind of fake news. They were not, in the 1880s, they were not stomping grapes with their feet back then. These were big businesses, and everything was more mechanical, but I think the sketch artist thought it would be more dramatic to have this kind of action thing. So, you can never believe, I guess, what you read in the paper. But they did push back. But this incident did cause the anti-Chinese clause to be inserted in the California Constitution. So it was actually still a big deal.
Was that part of your original research?
Mm-hmm.
I haven't heard that.
Yeah. It's an interesting kind of like oh, okay, I guess that makes sense how it all kind of ties together, right? So they couldn't force the vineyard owners to do it directly, but they could do it through legal means. But it turns out wine wasn't the only alcoholic beverage that the Chinese were involved in, right? There are also hop yards, where hops, of course, make beer. And that was very popular. Now, wine vineyards, as we know, are up and down the valley. Hop yards were only around St. Helena. So St. Helena, they were they were mostly destined for Europe. Not surprisingly, European beer was a big deal. Hops was also used for medicines and so on. But hop yards had a similar situation. They were, this is a sketch from 1880 on the left, and there's a little blow up. You can see Chinese workers there that were working on them. So hops are grown on poles. They're like these 10-foot poles are put in the ground. The hops grow up on them. And there's about 1,500 poles per acre. And so it's kind of expensive. It's kind of a capital-intensive crop. And so again, capital is high. You got to keep your labor low. So that's why you have Chinese. So again, as I said, there were 5 major hop fields around St. Helena, around Napa Valley, and they were all exclusively Chinese labor. Mining also. So as you all probably know, there's really not much gold or silver mines around here, but there was quicksilver or mercury. Okay, so that was the one element that could be mined, and it was fairly profitable. It was kind of always on the edge, but it was fairly profitable. And there were mines up and down all around kind of Mount St. Helena and kind of the hills of Napa Valley. And some were white. This is how they characterized themselves, kind of white miners only, mixed Chinese and white miners, and then Chinese miners only. The one we actually know a fair bit about is the Great Western Mine. So it's actually a book was written. The daughter of the supervisor wrote a book about her time on the mines. She has some anecdotes about the Chinese there, which is kind of interesting. They had 2 camps they lived in because this is pretty far away from town, so you had to live there. One was called Camp Number 1. One was called Brown China Camp. Don't know why. Camp Number 1 was people that were from Canton region. Brown China Camp. Everybody else lived there. And the passage of the California Constitution, the one in 1879, caused the mine to shut down for the time being because they couldn't, they said, we just can't operate. If we can't have Chinese labor, we can't operate at all. So the whole thing shut down. It was eventually overturned, thank goodness. This is a picture of the camps where the Chinese miners lived. These shacks, there's no running water, needless to say, and they were wooden. They had to be constructed by the miners themselves. They had to cook on the front using kind of open flame, and so so fire was always a strong worry. And there's a story apparently some of the Chinese were storing fireworks underneath one of the tents, one of the cabins for Lunar New Year, and I guess their cooking fire got on the fireworks and blew up a few of the cabins. So that's not good. But this was where they lived. This is a picture. It might be hard to see of the Great Western Mine staff. And so what we can see here. It's hard to tell, but you can kind of get the shapes. So in the middle, you've got the white supervisors and their wives are in the middle, and you have the Chinese kind of all around them. And there's generally kind of a story that the Chinese didn't like their pictures being taken individually, but they did like the group shots. So there was a lot going on the countryside. Now in towns, it's just as much, right? So there was actually a lot of Chinese workers in town. So domestically, if you remember when we looked at the different kinds of jobs that they did, so as a domestic servant or a cook, this was a very popular pastime, an occupation for Chinese workers. They were called China boys, and it didn't matter how old you were called a China boy if you were this. And if you were a middle class or above, it gave you a little bit of luxury to have on-site, somebody working to help you with chores. And of course, back then everything was like really hard, right? So I think having servants were great, and it was the same kind of thing. They had this reputation of being reliable, fairly compliant, and so on. We do know, so we have a letter from, this is the Lyman household, and Lyman, they was a farm just outside St. Helena, and they had a cook named Ah Hing who worked for them from 1884, actually all the way to 1919, so actually a little past the end of our story. And he started as a young man. Over the left and the right, he's older, and he was kind of the cook, but he also was kind of the general manager. The recollections we have of the son there, that he was pretty harsh taskmaster, made sure that the boys did their homework properly, that he would, they had other Chinese labor coming in to work on the vegetable plots and all that stuff, so he would supervise them. So he was definitely kind of he really ran the household. So, and this is the sense you get from a lot when you read any sort of anecdotes about the Chinese kind of servants in the household. It was actually not a very negative relationship. It was actually more positive than others. They really did become pretty integral. And but the son, I think his name was Rob, talked about when Ah Hing would occasionally go back to China, and this was fairly common. If you could afford it, you'd go back to China, be with your family a little bit, and then come back to the United States to earn money. The son always liked it when Ah Hing went back home because whoever they had substitute was always easier. So it's kind of like substitute teachers, I guess, when we were at school. Napa had Sawyer Tannery. Right, and so many of you have heard of Napa leather, right? Well, that's because Napa leather was copywritten or trademarked in Napa, and it started around the Napa River there with 2 or 3 white workers and 7 or 8 Chinese workers, and they had a primarily Chinese workforce for the first 10 or 20 years, and that grew, and that was a major employer in downtown Napa. They had dedicated housing, like dormitories, set up in downtown Napa for their workers in the tannery. And they were quite popular. And you can see actually there on the left, you get a picture of, this was when they were bigger, some workers. Now we have the white workers got pictures, and then in the little window up there, you have 2 Chinese workers looking out the side. I will say, so Sawyer, it was progressive in a way, but unfortunately, during the initial rise of the anti-Chinese leagues, they were the first one to fire all their Chinese workers in the mid-1880s. So unfortunately, while they grew big on the backs of the Chinese laborers, they didn't really stick with them when they're going out rough. Chinese laundries is also interesting. So Chinese laundries is a little bit of a trope, right? We've probably heard of it, but they did dominate the laundry industry. And laundry, if we remember back, think of the 1880s, 1890s, was hard, right? It was hard work doing laundry. And so I think if you could all afford to have somebody else do your laundry, you did it. And it was dominated by Chinese workers. In Napa, St. Helena, and Calistoga, Chinese-owned laundries were everywhere, and much to the consternation, certainly, of newspapers and so on. There were all these calls for non-Chinese laundries. Please have, they would call them white laundries. Please let's have a white laundry. And you'll see ads so this is about doing white clothes, owned by white people. And this is an ad. I don't know if this was in the Star or the Register. We are prepared to do laundry work without the aid of Chinese and guarantee satisfaction. So it tended to be that one of your main value propositions when you were a white laundry is you were not Chinese. And ironically, this ad was in the same issue as this article, which basically says the Napa White Laundry suspended operations because they could not keep up with they couldn't keep up with the Chinese laundries. So basically, they could not do the work for the price, the quality of the work, and so they closed. And this is much to the consternation of certainly the editorial staff on the local papers, that we kept having these Chinese laundries. Napa, I didn't say Helena, but Napa certainly they passed an ordinance saying that no male Chinese could run a laundry, and it was considered a public nuisance. And Sam Key, who started a laundry service in the 1880s in Napa, took it up to the state Supreme Court and got the ordinance overturned. and saying that, this is illegal, and this was, of course, overturned in Napa, and is actually, that case was cited 22 times around the country in trying to overturn local ordinances against Chinese. So so Sam Key did a nice thing, kind of railing up against against that. And so that's what when we talk about successes, really Chinese had a couple of different, certainly, they were a couple of different things that we're talking about. They had quite a few legal successes. Now, they were not successful, and we won't talk about today, but it's in the book. There was if you were involved in Chinese on, as we know today, Chinese on Chinese crime, if you were accused of murder or anything like that, you were, it was not good if you were Chinese, right? They were allowed to testify now. This was in the 1870s that was allowed, but basically the jurors were told you can disregard any testimony from a Chinese person because, of course, they're not trustworthy, right? And so, but if you did not get much justice from the criminal justice system. You did get justice, though, from like the constitutional law system. And so they were pushed back on the laundry thing. The one, not Great Western, but the Sulphur Springs mine up here in St. Helena, in Calistoga, they pushed back against the California Constitution because they lost. They were a 50-50, half Chinese, half white quicksilver mine. When the California Constitution went into effect, they challenged the Constitution and got the California Constitution overturned, right? Well, that article was overturned because they said, there's no reason for us not to be able to employ Chinese workers. So you got a little kind of Calistoga mining company got an article in the California Constitution overturned because of the Chinese. And also, they also refused to vacate Chinatown here, which I'll talk about in a second. And economically, though, so their peak of their power was, of economic power was around 1887 or so. So if you remember, we talked about 1882, that's when the Exclusion Act came in. That stopped the flow of immigrant Chinese laborers from coming into the nation, and certainly California and Napa Valley. But it didn't evict anybody, right? So all the workers that were here. And so you kind of had this great increase, and then it kind of plateaued off, right? But nobody gave the winery owners the memo or anything like that. So Napa Valley in particular kept growing like crazy. And so all it did, as we know, right, supply and demand, supply was fixed. And so they started getting more economic power. And the Chinese are like, hey, you know what? We've got some power here. And so they actually went on strike, right? So much for being these docile workers who would do whatever, right? So they actually got a raise in 1887 from $1.25, $1.50 a day, because it was up to $1.25 at that point. They went to $1.50. The hop workers saw, hey, if the vineyard workers go on strike, we can go on strike too. And so they got a raise. And so it was actually great, because during this time, as you can see here, the 1880, 1886, number of wineries actually grew from 48 to 175. So it was just crazy growth. And they needed Chinese labor more than ever, and it wasn't available. So that was the peak of their economic power. Briefly then, let's talk about their culture and what we're doing there. So Chinese New Year, right? Happy Chinese New Year. It's going on this week and beyond. And so I just want to talk briefly about a few things with their culture. So Chinatowns was big, right? So every town in the Napa Valley had a Chinatown. There was one in Napa, one in St. Helena here, one in Calistoga. There was even one in Rutherford. And they talk about a small one in Yountville, but I'm not sure about that one. But certainly there were at least 4. And the key thing was Chinese, and this is a little mixed, could not or weren't allowed to own property. Certainly they couldn't in Chinatowns. Those Chinatowns were all owned by kind of white landowners who would then lease the either buildings or whatever for the Chinese that would live there. And these Chinatowns were little communities, right? There were homes, but there were stores, there were opium dens, there were all sorts of, there were hotels, there were gambling houses. Everything was here in Chinatowns, and everybody had them, and that allowed them, to kind of, that was their center of life. One of the things, though, and they were relatively self-contained. Certainly in St. Helena they were, and somewhat in Napa. Now, the one thing that the newspapers do talk about that kind of brought the whole community together were funeral processions, right? So the notion of funerals and dying was, important to everybody, but the Chinese in particular, right? They were very tied to their villages and their clans, and being buried back in China. That was very important. And the funereal rites were very important too. And here, if a Chinese person died here, if they were of any sort of means, there were big processions that would go through town, either through St. Helena or through Napa, through Calistoga, and there would be a hearse. It was important to have loud music to scare away evil spirits. So there would be a band. Now, other parts of the state apparently had to have, sometimes you have American bands that would play. But here, they were big enough that there was a Chinese band out of Napa, also a Chinese band out of San Francisco. So they would come up and they would kind of lead the procession to try to scare away the spirits. You'd have all the Chinese citizens would march down the road, and then there'd be a cart filled with all the food that was going to be eaten at the celebration of life afterwards. And it was interesting because the newspapers reported on this, and it was actually one of the more respectful kind of reporting. It's actually they were fairly impressed with the whole process through that. So it was a way, though, to kind of integrate things. Now, Chinese were buried. A lot of them died here. Some were disinterred. Most weren't. Most that died here made this their final resting place. There were Chinese graves in both Tulaque Cemetery in Napa and, of course, the cemetery here in St. Helena. Unfortunately, in St. Helena, they were buried in an area called Chinese Potter's Field. Now, for those who know the term Potter's Field, it tends to have something for the indigent, right? People that can't afford a grave, they get put them in the Potter's Field. It seems here that this was it really didn't mean, because there were, I think, all kind of levels of economic success. But if you were Chinese, you went to the Chinese Potter's Field. And most of it was washed away in a flood in 1930. So we kind of don't have many monuments there. In Napa, there's still, most of the gravestones were wood, so a lot of them have burned or disintegrated, but there are still 7 stone tombstones in Napa that do that. In St. Helena, we do not have that. We have little markers where the Chinese were, but we don't have any information. The cemetery itself, the records, they do have the information. There are I believe 45 Chinese people buried there, and men and women, and they died. They have actually their cause of death, and it was the same stuff everybody else was dying from, right? It was tuberculosis and consumption and so on, a few suicides. But it was interesting to kind of see that. So that's but unfortunately, you go to St. Helena, there's nothing saying or commemorating where they were. Religion was very important. They were all Taoist. Chinese, there's Confucian, Buddhism, whatever, but everybody that came over here was Taoist. And it's closely tied with Chinese Freemasons. And just briefly, so it's interesting. So the Chinese Freemasons, so that's what this is a fraternal group. Now what this was actually a group, kind of rebellious group in China that was against the current dynasty and the current emperor. And they were kind of a subversive group. When people started coming over to the United States, they started forming these same groups here, right? And there was kind of these underground movements of Chinese people. And the people certainly in San Francisco were a little worried, and so I guess some newspapers sent some people kind of incognito to spy on these meetings to see what was going on. And it turns out they really didn't like the Chinese emperors, but they didn't care about American stuff. And so the newspapers reported back, oh, this is a fairly benign organization. It's kind of like the Freemasons, right? And the Chinese loved that name, and they adopted it. So they called themselves Chinese Freemasons because, now it has nothing to do with the Freemasons that we know from Ben Franklin or National Treasure or whatever else you heard. But they called themselves that. But they were a fraternal organization that were about supporting each other. So you had to be a person of good standing. You had to not have any, you had to pay into a funeral fund that would help your fellow Freemasons get buried. You had to help them. You couldn't testify against or say bad things about each other. But they were groups, and one thing too, they would help fund temples in the different Chinatowns. And you knew you kind of made a mark when your Chinatown had a temple. And they were called in the newspapers Joss houses. And Joss is like a Portuguese word, I think, for God, so it kind of got a little corrupted. But the Freemasons would sponsor and build these temples, and this is just a picture of the altar in the Joss house in Napa that was actually saved before it was destroyed. The altar itself was saved and is in San Francisco. So just briefly here, we have the picture. This is a picture, and we don't have many pictures. This is a sketch of the Chinatown in Napa, right along the Napa River in downtown. This is a picture just of Chanhua Jack, who was a merchant, and his children, and they was on the steps in downtown Napa, Chinatown during a New Year's parade. This is the picture we got of Calistoga's Chinatown. If you've ever been to the Sharpstein Museum in Calistoga, this is part of their diorama. They have the main diorama, which is really cool, showing Calistoga, and they have a little side diorama, which has got Chinatown. But you can see it's literally on the wrong side of the tracks, right? You have Calistoga off to the right. A lot of Chinese worked on the railroads, and so they were kind of like there, so you imagine it's pretty loud where they are, but a lot of them worked on the railroads, so it was convenient to them.
Is that illustration in your book?
Yes. Yeah, pictures in the book, yeah. And then this is kind of our one picture, which is the same picture right here, Old St. Helena Chinatown, and this is the one picture we have. This is just a part of it. Now, so you can see, again, it's kind of similar to the shacks that were in the mine. So they were all wooden, kind of wooden structures. They were kind of hastily built. Fire was a constant problem. St. Helena Chinatown burned a couple of times. Napa Chinatown burned a couple of times. But everything, it was all here. Now, these were mostly single men who lived here. And they were not, so single, men living together is not great anyway. And a lot of them were very poor, right? Because they didn't make much money working, and they sent money home, and they gambled, and they drank, and the things that then did opium, everything that, they do. And so it was an eyesore, needless to say. Now, the battle for Chinatown in St. Helena is quite interesting. So Chinatown was on the south end of town. So it's where the Ford dealership is now, pretty much. That's where Chinatown was, and it was the land was owned by John Gillum. He's a landowner, and when he first kind of bought the land with the intention of putting Chinese on it, that was kind of was an economic kind of model that he had. It was far away from where St. Helena was, but over the 10, 20 years. The Chinese population grew and the town expanded. And so instead of being way far away, it got closer and closer and closer. And also, it was on the south end of town. So you think about it, as we drive up Highway 29, the same way if you were taking the railroad up, well, it was the first thing you saw. And the Chamber of Commerce did not like the fact that the first thing people saw when they came into St. Helena was Chinatown. Because there were open sewers, there was kind of, it was just not a nice place. And so the townspeople hated Chinatown and kept trying to kick them out, right? To get rid of Chinatown. And John Gillum would say, well, I don't like them either. Number one, you should be thankful because I'm giving them a place to stay, so they're not staying in the homes around downtown. But also, it's a fair amount of my net worth is in Chinatown, so I can't just sell it. And so a group of anti-Chinese businessmen got together and in 1886 bought Chinatown from John Gillum. Even though a Chinese organization, the Chinese Six Companies, offered him more money, he still sold it to the anti-Chinese group. And St. Helena Star was overjoyed. Oh my God, thank God. Chinatown sold, we can get rid of the Chinese in our midst. But what happened is a lot of the Chinese had these long-term leases, some with no expiration date from John Gillum, and they took the anti-Chinese group to court and held them up in court for years and didn't pay any rent during the time that they were in court. So I think who won, I guess. So just to wrap it up then, so they're gone. So why are they gone? So there was a couple of things. Certainly there was a big rise in anti-Chinese sentiment, and there were two tracks that happened. One was economic, which is what we hear today. Well, as a matter of fact, a lot of the stuff we hear today. One is that they are taking our jobs, right? And I just have, you can't read it, it's all right, but you can see articles starting as early as 1784, and it's kind of like this, hey, do you like this? We have all these Chinese here. Are we comfortable with this? Are they taking our jobs? And by the time you hit to the mid-1880s, you've got the Chinese must go, and the war against Chinese, and we have to get them out of here because they're taking our jobs. Again, there really weren't people to replace the jobs, but this was a big thing. So there was an economic kind of push about why the Chinese must go. But at the same time, though, we also got the morality tale, right? The Chinese brought gambling. The Chinese brought opium. And they are corrupting our youth, all right? Now, they did gamble a lot. I mean, this is where it's like there's no, nobody's an angel, right? So there was a lot of gambling. It was a very popular pastime in China. These were single men who had nothing else to do in the evening, so there was a lot of gambling. They did use opium. Opium was but opium in the Chinese culture is used much like going to a bar is in American culture, right? And opium was actually it was available, as you probably know. It's like medications, everything had opium in it back in the day, and so on. But it was really considered a kind of this kind of scourge. And so, boy, we have to get rid of the Chinese because they're affecting the morality of our kids. And so those two things, there were anti-Chinese groups that were formed in Napa, St. Helena, Calistoga, Yountville, to drive them out. They weren't particularly successful in the mid-1880s, but they were eventually successful. And so by the 1900s, early 1900s, most Chinese are gone. So why are they gone? Well, demographics, right? So we talked about not only did the immigration of Chinese laborers, merchants could come and go, but laborers were stopped in the 1882, and so of course they kind of trickled out because they eventually aged out and so on. But there was a very conscious position of the United States government that they did not want Chinese families here, so no women were allowed. So 1882 was a seminal act that if you ever do immigration history, that's an act that everybody knows about. 1875, called the Page Act, was passed to prevent immigration of women of ill repute. Okay, and Chinese women of ill repute, and so theoretically prostitutes, but they basically was used to prevent any Chinese woman from emigrating, okay? Because everybody was afraid, well, you have the Chinese families come in, they're gonna settle, and we're gonna have more Chinese citizens. We don't want that. So they said, well, the Chinese men could come in, work, and then they, of course, they would go home because they didn't have their families here. So it was an intentional kind of policy of the United States government to do that. So they had no families. There were no second and third generation for most of these laborers, and so there were no laborers, and so they didn't backfill themselves. And so that's why the Chinese population declined, and the act, kind of finally takes its toll. And then also, then we also had then at that point in the 1890s and 1900s, especially in the wine industry, we had some problems. Okay, so phylloxera, which was a thing that was decimating the vineyards of France, made it over here. Okay, and so a lot of the wineries had to replant a bunch of their grapes with disease-resistant strands, and so the demand for vineyard labor in particular went down. Plus, in the 1890s, you start having the initial kind of things of prohibition, and so the demand for wine went down. Right? And there was this economic depression. So you've got these multiple things that were collapsing the economy around St. Helena and Napa Valley. You had the Italians then came in around the 1880s or so. And the Italians came in and they didn't know how to do wine because they did wine back from Italy. And they were allowed to own property, right? And so a lot of the Italian families came in, they could work the fields and they could buy these distressed wineries, right? So they actually then when they kind of come up, we get this thing. Oh, and then finally, I should also mention, when they rebuilt the vineyards, they made it so it was better for mechanical and more efficient harvesting of grapes, so they raised them up, right? Now they're 3 feet off the ground, they're spread out apart, you can have the mechanical pickers go in there. One worker could tend like 20 acres of grapes in most times, except for harvest, right? So you didn't need, the demand wasn't there. But, so then the Italians could kind of do it. And so now what you've got, and so this was just on the Visit Napa Valley website last year, I don't know if it's still there, but it talks about California's wine country has deep Italian roots. One can only imagine the pleasure with Italian immigrants first discovered the region in the mid-19th century, and so on. Now, my great-grandfather was the first Italian to come to Napa Valley, so I'm all happy that the Italians came. But it's interesting. This is what we are taught now, right? It's the Italian. They kind of came in and they did it, but they did it kind of on the backs of the kind of the work the Chinese did, and we don't unfortunately see anything about the Chinese. But it's kind of interesting to see how the stories we kind of tell ourselves. So, but that's basically it. So that's kind of the story of the Chinese in Napa Valley and what they did. And I said to me, it's a success story. But the important thing, and the thing that I'm about, is really, and I'm so encouraged here, I think just having it part of our history and what we teach ourselves and teach our kids, especially in Napa, who aren't doing it, I think is really, really important. And so that's what the book is about, and that's kind of what getting the word out. So anyway, that is it. There's a lot going on.
I just want to say Chinatown was not down at Sulphur Springs by the Ford dealer. It was at McCorkle Avenue, just south of God's.
Perfect. Okay, very good.
Questions? Anyone?
Yeah, we got a few minutes.
Yes.
To a large extent, the Chinese built California because they were willing to do the work that the whites wouldn't do. But the white people took credit for the work.
Exactly right. So that's why I think the story in the Napa Valley is so interesting, because we have a relatively small area, right? And we got agriculture, we got mining, we got Chinatowns, we got everything just right here. So it's an interesting kind of thing, but you're exactly right. That's what it is. We're basically kind of a tariff.
In the back?
So in the 90s, did the Chinese people leave the United States, or did they spread?
So it's interesting. So there are not close records, but basically I think what happened, generally speaking, is they died, right? Just of natural causes, or workplace accidents was big. A lot of them, there was also this rise of anti-Chinese sentiment, which I talk about in the book, wasn't time today, that kind of pushed a lot out. So a lot of the remaining Chinese went to San Francisco, went to Oakland. I think it was safety in numbers, and so a lot of them went to the cities where there was kind of more protection of that. And so that's where a lot of them went, and some went back to China. So if you can afford it, you went back to China or the cities, or you passed away. There are very few. I think in the current, I didn't look this up, I heard this, that the current, like the Chinese population of Napa, or maybe it's Napa County, is like 0.3% right now. So there are not many kind of families that kind of stuck around.
And we actually have records at Salem Cemetery of when a person was exhumed. They would bury the person at first, and then the bones could be boxed in a very small box and shipped back to be buried with the ancestors. And we have the records at Salem Cemetery.
Yeah.
Question in back?
Yeah, you had one slide that mentioned Japanese
Yes.
immigration. So did that begin to grow and sort of transfer those?
Yeah, you know, that was kind of at the end of my period, so I really didn't go into much on that. It was more the, I really did end it with the Italian. So I'm not sure on the Japanese thing. I think there was a lot of anti-Asian prejudice, generally speaking, but they came in after the Chinese. But no, I don't actually know the story of the Japanese, and it's probably its own interesting story in and of itself.
Yeah.
You do a great job of sort of staying out of the story, but what was the personal motivation? Were you just fascinated by the topic like all the rest of us are, or was there something that has since you?
Right, so I was upset, pissed off that we were not taught this in school. Right, that was my motivation. It's like, you gotta be kidding me that this whole thing lost. At the same time that we had this rise in anti-Asian hate around the pandemic, and those two things, like, you gotta be kidding me. This story needs, that's why I want to do it. My goal is to have it taught in schools. It's already being taught here, which is terrific. But if we can get taught in Napa schools, then I think we've got it. Because, you know, and to me, it doesn't lessen the impact of the Italians or the Germans, all the other people that came in. It doesn't, or learning about George Young. We can still learn about George Young. That's great. But we can also learn about the Chinese, right? So it's not an either or situation. So that was kind of the thing that got me, but yeah, thanks.
I had a question. I'm also a grad from UC Berkeley.
Excellent.
I think studied with Ron Coffee that a lot of immigrants fled through the Chinese Exclusion Act into Mexico, and there's complete cities over there, Soviet African Americans during the century. I see in history a lot of times these Chinatowns like Eureka, they all were pushed either leave or die and leave.
That's right.
And they did go into Chinatown. What's interesting for me is, since I grew up and raised here, I see all those bridges that still exist that were done by the Chinese, and the walls.
That's right.
And I always was very impressed by the work. You know, that they said, well, at least that's what I was told, and that was like the only thing that kind of I got to see, and these pictures. So I kind of want to know, was there? It shows a diverse labor force. Was there, like, Mason? I know there's Freemason.
You know, it's a good question. The only thing I found, I mean, Mary may know more, there was talk about Chanwell Jack's son who in Napa they own a China store, and they would go up valley in their buggy delivering things to Chinese people up valley, and he talks about, hey, you know, he saw these workers dealing with boulders that were hundreds of pounds, putting them together to build the walls. But I could not find any kind of records. Like, I was asked, actually, we had a Napa event last week, and somebody asked, oh yeah, I have all these walls on my property, were they made by Chinese? Probably, but I don't have any records. I couldn't find anything about that. But he said they were called China walls. That's what they're on the property. Like, yeah, they probably were, but no, I don't really know. But they talk about that a lot.
That's what I was going to ask about, because I had always known that they were called China walls across the front of where the CIA is now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all those walls along.
They probably did. I mean, they talked about building walls is one of the things, but it's always just talked about in passing. So we don't know, unfortunately.
Just another thing, that the contractors who got the jobs to make those walls were often Italian, and they would hire unskilled laborers to do the grunt work. So yeah, the engineering was probably Italian stonemasons. Yeah.
All right.
There was
Here.
a newspaper article in one of the images
Mhm.
for articles.
Yes.
One of them talked about a school where
Yes.
the Chinese were being taught, and
That's
then
correct.
the school was shut down.
Right.
Because the Chinese who were being taught there weren't paying taxes.
That's correct. So there was a pushback. I have in the book, I don't have time here. There were some children, right? So there were children that were here because merchant families could be here, and some ship the daughters of captains were here. So there were some children, and one of the earliest things we've got in the 1870s is they were being educated. They were being taught in a school in the evening. So they were not taking the space of any white students, but that was why are we letting the Chinese be taught here and take away our tax dollars? They're not paying taxes. Later on, there were Chinese schools kind of done. The churches initially did that, and they educated them in the 1890s. They were integrated into the school district, and they were actually taught themselves. But when the churches were doing it, the parents or the whoever would pay for the students to be taught. So it was really that was really much like you see today. It was kind of like a red herring, right? Let's get all riled up, even though they really weren't taking anything from them. But yeah.
Did you come across records of the roads being built? I was told some years ago, but I've never seen it in a documentary source, that Ink Grade, that Mr. Ink took his crews out there, Chinese crews, and built all of Ink Grade.
Oh, I don't know about specifics. There is a story in the book, which I do talk about, which is interesting, is there was a crew that was building a road, I think by around St. Helena, out toward Silver Trail, and the workers went on strike for more money. The foreman fired them all, hired Chinese workers to build the road, who were going to take less money, and that went on for a year. And then eventually, the white workers came back for less money to match the Chinese. So there's kind of this kind of story, which undoubtedly sparked resentment of the white workers. So we have some stories about that, but I don't know in particular. Like the problem we have is they didn't really care about them, right? So all the kind of records you want to see. I mean, I think a lot of the Chinese workers was like interchangeable parts. We don't really kind of know a lot about the individual things like the different roads, and at least I couldn't find. I mean, Mary may know. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming.
Right.